So, it's a huge topic and we aren't necessarily aware of it. But indeed, social networks and artificial intelligence, by the way, now also, which adds up, are used by foreign powers to destabilize our democracies. So, there you cited a case. I don't know who is behind it, but in any case, there is evidence to show that it comes from abroad and that it is rather to destabilize us. For example, a few months ago, there was false information. It wasn't a fake site circulating, but it was false information saying that we had sent 1,000 legionnaires to the front in Ukraine. You might have perhaps read it, maybe even believed it for a moment. All of this was completely false, but it circulated and was seen millions of times. And the best example to see the risk we face is what happened in Romania, where elections were annulled at the first in the round with a technique somewhat similar to what you just described and what you have denounced. That is to say, in Romania, the pro-Russians, assisted by Russia, systematically set up for months fake accounts and first identified people who were vulnerable to false information because it doesn't work on everyone. There is a form of vulnerability. So, people who were interested in alternative medicine, people who were interested in religions, that does not mean that everyone will believe nonsense when they look at those sites, but it creates predispositions. In any case, they had identified those as possible zones. And then, the local information. And they methodically created fake accounts, fake ones, for months. Pages, thousands and thousands of fake pages. But they ended up attracting people. And then, when the campaign was launched, the candidate who was supported, pushed by the pro-Russians, started to create networks that linked back to these fake accounts. And that created a viral loop which resulted in him having absolutely insane success and being propelled by all this, which obviously distorted the democratic process. So, all this to tell you that we are not talking about fictions, about things that are not possible. This happened in a major democracy of the European Union, what I am telling you. And so it is clear that it is going to happen. In any case, they will try things during electoral deadlines as they did there for Russia. So what do we do in the face of this? Indeed, it was said, we have created an agency that is virginum, and so it watches, relays, conducts investigations, and now we release the information. And as soon as the information is established, we have a dialogue with the sites, and thus how we can act, and what our action is, and what perhaps has been. I will verify. Because I don't know the exact case you mentioned. But what do we do about these sites? The only thing we can legally do today is look at all these fake sites and say that they do not comply with the terms of service, and we ask them to the removal. And so that's what the virginum teams do. They request the removal of these sites, all this information, when it is identified as interference. However, it's extremely long, complicated, slow, and so we can see that we are in a phase, and that's what we are preparing. We will have to toughen up, and so what we want to implement, and we did a little with the first directives, the Digital Services Directive that was pushed by France in 2022 during our presidency, and then adopted a few months later. Later is to establish a real system of platform accountability. The only way to be very reactive and to avoid suffering, as you mentioned, is for hosts or platforms to have a responsibility when they allow it. Prosper false information or fake sites that are the result of interference. Just as you would be, as a press entity, if there were false information pushed in one of the titles of the EBRA Group or an interference, I would ask you to remove it or the virginum, and if it was not done, we would hold your responsibility accountable. That is not the case today for those sites. So, 1, it exists, and what you described shows. 2, we can now attribute it. That is to say, we most often manage to trace it back to states. I mentioned Russia, which is the most aggressive, but it's not the only one. We could come back to that. 3, we managed to act, but really, it's a daily battle for the teams. 4, now we will have to industrialize, so we are putting much more resources. We are also putting them in place to alert everyone to this risk, and then to establish a system of responsibility for platforms and networks so that they remove content much faster. And if they do not remove it, for them to themselves make hunt down and bear responsibility when they allow these interferences to thrive. Reporter: I work in communication. I am engaged with social media daily, and I am of both Romanian and French nationality. Exactly a year ago, the first round of the Romanian elections was annulled by the Constitutional Court, which is historic and created a strong mobilization within the Romanian diaspora, of which I was a part. We had many concerns given the background of our country, which experienced a very severe communist regime. Until recently, Romania is a country close to France, and my question, to which you have already partially responded, is to know how, with the upcoming municipal and presidential elections next year, we can protect ourselves and avoid experiencing what Romania or even Moldova have gone through. Macron. Thank you. So I began to answer. Romania has provided a feedback report. There is a very comprehensive report that was done by Romania and shared with us, which allows me to tell you what I just explained with the methodical work that was done before by, I would say, largely the Russians and the pro-Russians. Moldova also had its election, with a lot of interference and meddling from Russia, which tried to manipulate. The most organized system we've seen is clearly the one in Romania because it was done with both fake information on the networks, but a lot of controls, and so, in some way, they created a cloud. Then, they accelerated. In Moldova, it was a lot of fake information that was pushed by accounts. So, the way to prepare for it is first, to strengthen the system, which is what we're doing with Virginium. Second, to make things public. That is to say, in a democracy, we are all antibodies to interference. Normally, when we know we are victims of this, when we know we can be exposed to it, and that's why their whole strategy relies first on people who are a bit more vulnerable or gullible, whom they identify, but all of us, if we are clear-headed and aware of it, that we know the risk exists, we are more careful, we are more vigilant. And that's very important, and the importance of our discussions for me is that it creates vigilance because we become aware. Honestly, 1 or 2 years ago, I think no one would have had the debate in a room like this today. 2 years ago, no one would have said it could happen. No one. And I would even say, going back to just before 2022, which is not so long ago, before the outbreak of the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine, we had much less interference, much fewer information wars pushed by Russia. You would have told me he is crazy or he is paranoid. But today, it's truly a reality. So, our vigilance is first and foremost something that protects us. Then, we will proceed at the beginning early next year with a very comprehensive work that has been done on this subject, led by Virginium and the General Secretariat for Defense and National Security, along with the best experts. And we will also involve all the experts from various think tanks, academics, to explain how this risk exists. And then, thirdly, we are setting up systems where we disconnect much faster, as I mentioned. That is, we are creating a responsibility for the platforms. There is another battle linked to this. Finally, there are 2 things that I consider very important in this battle, and that need to be highlighted here. The first is the issue of fake accounts, what we call bots, trolls. You might have heard about it, but you don't see them. That is to say, when you have a message that is widely shared, you think to yourself, oh my, there have been 2 million people who supported it. When then, this message or this information ends up going viral, when it then sometimes becomes a form of information, in any case a social fact, which is then legitimately picked up by the press because they say there are still 2.5 million people who pushed it. You can't say today if it's 2 million people. You know that there are 2 million accounts, but you can't say if there are real people behind these accounts. So, there are people who do this for commercial reasons, sometimes political, but there are many people who use this for geopolitical reasons. And those who interfere, in the case of Romania, it has been very well identified, there were massive troll farms. And so, you had millions of fake accounts that were mobilized. We must demand from these social networks that they ensure, that they guarantee that behind every account there is a real person. Another question, which we may come back to in the debate, is that of anonymity. But at the very least, we need to know if there is someone real or not. And if there isn't a real person, we can see that it distorts interactions, it distorts democracy. It distorts it when there is an issue of interference. But even when we are going to exchange with someone on a particular account, if it's a fake account, everything changes if there isn't a real person behind it. So that's something we'll demand, we'll fight for. It's a battle we will have to lead at the European level. And it is absolutely key. The second is that during election periods, we must no longer allow the purchase of information pages. And here, if you'll allow me, I'd like to make a small parenthesis, just for a minute, because when we talk about all this, we will return, I think, to all the topics related to social networks. I think that collectively, we must never forget what we're talking about, and I think this little clarification is important for all of us, meaning that when I want to inform myself, I will watch a newspaper on television. We have people who are paid for that. And there is a public contribution, there is an economic model behind it, where I will buy a press title, regional or national, I pay to be informed. Then after, newspapers will supplement this remuneration with what they receive from classified ads or advertising. But there is an economic model. I pay to be informed. I approach professional people. Social networks, when we get informed on them, is it designed for you inform? No. What are social networks for? They are made to attract you, to create excitement in you, to sell personalized advertising pages. That's the economic model. And that's why the infrastructure that these social networks constitute, and I'm not saying it's good or bad, because it allows for doing lots of great things, alerting, exchanging, etc. But it's an infrastructure that is created today with an economic model that is not non-profit, as we say in English. In good French, it's not charitable. It's an economic model based on the sale of personalized advertisements because, in fact, they will collect data about you to be able to say to a certain advertiser, I have someone who likes this type of product or who is inclined, I will be able to push your advertisements to them. It's much better than displaying them or even placing them in the press. That's why we've lost a lot of money in our press model because of that. So, if that's the case, one must understand that the purpose of these social networks is not that you have deliberation, that you are informed. Their purpose is for you to spend as much time as possible on them, to create the maximum excitement, to gather the maximum amount of information, and to be able to push the maximum number of advertising pages to you. Once we understand that, we realize that, in the grand scheme of things, argumentation is the least interesting for social networks because when I change an argument, it doesn't create frustration or excitement. I get informed, which is very good, and then I leave. Emotion is better because it will generate more traffic. But negative emotion is even better because it leads to anger, rage, etc. Look, when we're on a social network, what works? It's that or what's addictive and what the algorithms pick up. And so, let's never forget in our discussions that when we talk about social networks, and I'm saying this, it can be something great, social networks too. But we are talking about something that is structured to create dependency, excitement, and thus rather negative emotions, because they make their money by pushing personalized advertising to you. Once we understand this bias, we realize that it's probably not the best place to get informed primarily. And we can clearly see that this bias is a vulnerability to foreign interference because if I massively buy pages during the periods of pages or accounts or information that I can push, because I can also have things sponsored on these networks during electoral periods, well, I can completely penetrate the informational space. And so, beyond what we've discussed, transparency and the banning of trolls and fake accounts and the prohibition of any advertising during electoral periods, paid, sponsored pages or promoted content are key.